The Croatian mountains stretched endlessly before her, jagged peaks cutting through morning fog like broken glass. Maria Volkov pressed her bleeding feet against the frozen ground, 3 days into her escape from the prison camp that had held her for 8 months. Every breath burned her lungs, but she couldn't stop, not when the guards would discover her absence at dawn roll call. But Maria wasn't just any escaped prisoner. Before her capture, she'd been the Pentagon's top analyst on missing persons cases. Cases involving soldiers who vanished without explanation near religious sites across Eastern Europe. Cases she'd been investigating when her transport was ambushed. Now, standing before carved doors that bore symbols matching those in her classified files, Maria realized her imprisonment might not have been random. Someone had wanted her here, someone who knew exactly who she was and what she'd discovered. What truth lay hidden in those 20 rooms that was worth orchestrating her entire capture? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The symbols etched into the stone doors seemed to pulse in the early morning light, or perhaps that was just her exhaustion playing tricks on her mind. Maria traced one with a trembling finger, a stylized tree with roots that spiraled into infinity. She'd seen this exact marking in 17 different missing person files, always photographed at the last known location of the vanished soldiers. Her breath came in short, visible puffs as she circled the cathedral's perimeter. The structure defied logic. Gothic spires soared impossibly high for a building in the middle of nowhere, their surfaces unmarked by weathering, despite what appeared to be centuries of age. No roads led to this place, no power lines, no sign of modern construction equipment that could have transported such massive stones. The windows were dark, but Maria caught glimpses of movement within, shadows that seemed too deliberate to be tricks of light. Her training kicked in despite her weakened state. She counted 20 distinct sections, each with its own entrance, connected by covered walkways that formed an intricate pattern when viewed from above, like a maze designed to confuse rather than welcome. A sound from behind made her freeze, footsteps on gravel, too heavy to be mountain wildlife. Maria pressed herself against the cold stone wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd been so careful covering her tracks, avoiding the main paths, staying in the tree line. How had they found her so quickly? "She's here." The voice carried an accent she couldn't place, not Croatian, not Serbian, something older, just as the calculations predicted. Calculations? Maria's blood chilled. She edged toward the nearest cathedral entrance, weighing her options. The guards from the prison camp didn't talk about calculations. They barely spoke at all, communicating mostly through grunts and rifle gestures. The massive door swung open at her touch, revealing a vast interior lit by candles that shouldn't have been burning unattended. The space felt alive, humming with an energy that made her skin crawl. Rows of wooden pews faced an altar where something glinted in the flickering light, not a cross, but a geometric pattern that hurt to look at directly. Maria's intelligence training had prepared her for many things, but nothing like this. The walls were covered in photographs, hundreds of them, all showing the same face in different uniforms, different time periods, some in World War II German uniforms, others in modern American fatigues, still others in what appeared to be Civil War-era clothing. All of them showed Maria's face. Her legs gave out, and she collapsed onto the nearest pew. This was impossible. She was 34 years old, born in Michigan, raised by perfectly normal parents who kept photo albums documenting every birthday, every school play, every ordinary moment of an ordinary childhood. "You're beginning to remember." The voice came from behind the altar. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall, wearing robes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. 8 months of careful treatment, and still the conditioning holds. Remarkable. Maria tried to speak, but her throat had closed. The photographs stared down at her accusingly. In one, she stood beside what looked like a Nazi officer, smiling. In another, she wore a Union Army uniform, her hand resting on a telegraph machine. The faces around her changed, but her expression remained constant, calm, analytical, observant. The prison camp was never meant to break you, the figure continued, moving closer with deliberate steps. It was meant to prepare you, to strip away the false memories we gave you for this lifetime, so you could remember what you truly are. The footsteps outside grew closer. Through the stained glass windows, Maria could see lights approaching, not the harsh beams of prison camp guards, but something softer, more ceremonial, like a procession. "Welcome home, Maria," the figure said, pulling back its hood to reveal a face she recognized from dreams she'd convinced herself were nightmares. "We have so much work to do." The cathedral's shadow fell across Elena like a shroud as she pressed herself against its limestone wall. Her breathing came in ragged gasps, each exhale visible in the morning chill. Behind her, the distant sound of tracking dogs grew fainter, but she knew better than to trust the temporary reprieve. They would find her trail again soon enough. She forced herself to study the massive structure that had materialized from what should have been empty moorland. Gothic spires pierced the grey sky, their pointed arches reaching toward heaven with an urgency that made her stomach clench. The stonework appeared ancient, weathered by centuries, yet something about its placement here felt impossibly wrong. She had memorized every detail of the terrain during her 3 years of captivity, studying the horizon through barred windows, plotting escape routes that had never materialized until last night. This cathedral had not existed yesterday. Elena circled the perimeter, her bare feet silent on the frost-hardened ground. Stained glass windows depicted scenes she couldn't quite make out from this angle, their colors muted in the pale light. No bell tower marked the hours. No cemetery surrounded the building. It stood alone, as if someone had plucked it from a medieval city center and deposited it in the middle of nowhere for reasons she couldn't fathom. The main entrance faced east, its heavy wooden doors bound with iron hinges that showed no rust despite their apparent age. She approached cautiously, every instinct screaming warnings her rational mind couldn't process. The doors stood slightly ajar, darkness visible through the gap. From inside came the sound of voices. Elena froze, one hand reaching for the iron handle. The voices were speaking in unison, rhythmic and low, like a congregation reciting prayer. But the words were wrong somehow, the cadence unfamiliar. She strained to listen, recognizing neither the language nor the melody that seemed to weave through the spoken syllables. A twig snapped behind her. She spun around to find a man emerging from behind one of the flying buttresses. He wore simple brown robes, his head partially shaved in a monk's tonsure. His face was kind, weathered by sun and time, with pale blue eyes that seemed to look right through her prison-issued clothes to something deeper beneath. "You're hurt," he said, his accent carrying traces of something Eastern European, but not quite placing to any country she knew. Elena backed toward the door, her muscles coiled for flight despite their exhaustion. "Stay away from me. The cuts on your feet need attention, and you're cold." He gestured to her arms, where gooseflesh had risen despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "My name is Brother Matthias. You're safe here." "Safe?" The word came out as a bitter laugh. "There's no such thing as safe, not for people like me." "People like you?" His head tilted slightly, curiosity replacing concern in his expression. "What kind of person do you think you are, child?" The question struck her as odd, too philosophical for someone offering shelter to an obvious escapee. She studied his face for signs of deception, for the telltale tightness around the eyes that would mark him as another of her captor's agents. Instead, she found only genuine puzzlement. "I'm Elena Vasquez, resistance fighter, political prisoner number 7,742. She rattled off the identity that had sustained her through 3 years of interrogation and brutality. "I escaped from Blackstone facility approximately 6 hours ago." Brother Matthias frowned, the expression creating deep lines across his forehead. "I'm afraid I don't know what facility you're referring to. There are no prisons in this region. The compound is 15 miles northeast of here. Concrete walls, guard towers, electrified fence." Her voice rose as frustration bled through exhaustion. "You can't miss it. It's been there for years. Child, I have lived in this valley for 30 years. There is no prison compound. Elena stared at him, searching for any hint of deception. The voices inside the cathedral continued their strange chanting, the melody shifting to something that made her teeth ache. Behind her, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of something burning. "That's impossible," she whispered. Brother Matthias stepped closer, his movements slow and non-threatening. Many things seem impossible until we understand them properly. "Why don't you come inside? We can discuss this after you've had food and rest." "I can't. They're tracking me. Dogs, helicopters, search teams. If I stay anywhere too long..." "There are no helicopters here, child. No dogs. Listen." Elena held her breath, straining to hear the pursuit that had driven her through the night. The wind sighed through the cathedral's towers. The voices inside rose and fell in their incomprehensible rhythm. But beyond that, only silence stretched across the moor. The complete and utter silence of a world that had forgotten she existed. The cathedral's massive doors yielded to Elena's touch with surprising ease, their ancient hinges silent as if recently oiled. She slipped inside, her bare feet finding purchase on polished marble that seemed to gleam despite the dim light filtering through stained glass windows high above. The interior took her breath away. Soaring columns stretched toward a vaulted ceiling painted with scenes she couldn't quite make out in the shadows. Rows of wooden pews extended before her, leading to an altar draped in white cloth. But what struck her most was the warmth, not just temperature, but an inexplicable sense of sanctuary that made her shoulders drop for the first time in months. She moved deeper into the nave, her prison-issue clothing feeling suddenly crude against her skin. The silence was profound, broken only by her own breathing and the distant sound of voices. Elena froze, tilting her head to listen. The murmur was too low to understand, but it definitely came from somewhere ahead. Following the sound, she crept along the side aisle, using the massive pillars for cover. The voices grew clearer as she approached a side chapel, and she caught fragments of conversation that made her stomach clench. "Brought in 3 more today from Sector 7. Resistance activity increasing near the Eastern Territories. She'll want to review the files personally before." Elena pressed herself against the cold stone, her mind racing. These weren't priests or refugees seeking sanctuary. The clinical tone, the references to sectors and files, this was military intelligence. But whose? She risked a glance around the pillar and saw 5 figures seated around a table covered with maps and documents. They wore civilian clothes, but their bearing screamed military training. One was a woman with steel-grey hair pulled back severely, her fingers drumming impatiently on the table as she studied what looked like surveillance photographs. "The breakout at Camp 17 was more sophisticated than we initially assessed," the woman said, her voice carrying clearly in the stone chamber. "Someone provided inside information, guard schedules, patrol routes, blind spots in our surveillance grid." Elena's blood turned to ice. Camp 17. Her camp. "How many escaped?" asked a younger man, with a scar running from his left ear to his jaw. 4 initially. We recaptured 2 within 6 hours. 1 died during extraction. The grey-haired woman set down a photograph that Elena couldn't see clearly. "The 4th remains at large. Subject designation E47. Real name Elena Vasquez." The world tilted sideways. Subject designation. They weren't just talking about her escape, they were talking about her like she was an experiment, a specimen to be tracked and recovered. E47 was part of the cognitive restructuring program, the woman continued, opening a thick file. 3 years of treatment, showing promising results until she began displaying signs of recovered memory integration 6 weeks ago. Dr. Meridian flagged her as high risk for breakthrough episodes. Elena's knees nearly buckled. Cognitive restructuring, treatment, the fragmented memories that had been haunting her, faces she couldn't place, voices calling a name she almost but not quite recognized. Those weren't hallucinations brought on by stress and malnutrition. They were her actual memories, fighting to surface despite whatever had been done to suppress them. "What's the recovery protocol?" asked another voice. Alive, if possible. The neural mapping we've completed makes her too valuable to terminate unless absolutely necessary. But if she poses a risk to operational security... The woman's words trailed off, but the implication was crystal clear. Elena backed away from the pillar, her heart hammering so loud she was certain they would hear it. She had to get out, had to run, but her legs felt disconnected from her body. As she turned to flee, her elbow brushed against an ornate candle stand. It rocked slightly, the brass base scraping against stone with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire cathedral. The conversation in the chapel stopped abruptly. "Did you hear that?" The scarred man's voice was sharp with suspicion. Elena didn't wait to hear more. She ran, her bare feet slapping against the marble as she sprinted toward the main doors. Behind her, she heard chairs scraping back, urgent footsteps, shouted commands. The doors that had opened so easily now seemed impossibly heavy. She threw her weight against them, panic giving her strength, and burst out into the grey afternoon light. The forest beckoned ahead, but she could hear pursuit behind her, professional, coordinated, closing fast. As she plunged into the underbrush, branches tearing at her skin, one thought burned through her terror with crystalline clarity, everything she remembered about her life, about the war, about why she'd been imprisoned. All of it was a lie. And whatever the truth was, they were willing to kill to keep it buried. The voices behind her grew fainter as she pushed deeper into the woods, but Elena knew this was far from over. She wasn't just an escaped prisoner anymore. She was a test subject who had outlived her usefulness, carrying secrets in her reconstructed mind that someone desperately wanted back. The cathedral's interior stretched impossibly high above Elena, its vaulted ceiling lost in shadows that seemed to breathe with their own life. Stained glass windows depicted scenes she didn't recognize, not biblical stories, but something else entirely. Figures in military uniforms knelt before robed beings whose faces were obscured by geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. Her bare feet made no sound on the polished stone floor as she moved deeper into the nave. The silence felt unnatural, pressing against her eardrums like deep water. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to run, but the great doors had sealed themselves behind her with a finality that brooked no argument. Rows of wooden pews stretched toward an altar that defied architectural logic, seeming both distant and intimately close. As Elena approached, she began to make out details that made her stomach clench. The altar wasn't made of stone. It was metal, gleaming and surgical, with restraints built into its surface. Dark stains marked the channels carved along its edges. "You're earlier than expected." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating through the cathedral's bones. Elena spun, searching for its source, but found only shadows that shifted when she wasn't looking directly at them. "Who's there?" Her voice cracked from disuse and fear. A figure emerged from behind the altar, tall and draped in robes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The face beneath the hood was human, but wrong. Too symmetrical, with eyes that reflected light like an animal's. "You may call me Father Meridian," the figure said, gliding closer with movements that suggested joints bent in unnatural directions. "Though I suspect you have many questions about names, about who you really are." Elena backed away, her hand instinctively reaching for the knife she'd lost in her escape. "I know who I am. Elena Vasquez, resistance fighter, prisoner of war." "Is that what you remember?" Father Meridian's laugh was like glass breaking in reverse. "Or is that what was carefully placed in your mind? Tell me, Elena, if that is indeed your name, what do you recall of your life before the camp?" The question hit her like a physical blow. She opened her mouth to answer, to recite the familiar litany of her past, but the words wouldn't come. Her childhood in Madrid, her recruitment into the resistance, the mission that led to her capture, all of it felt suddenly insubstantial, like trying to grasp smoke. "The confusion on your face tells me everything," Father Meridian continued. "The memory implants are beginning to degrade. They always do given enough stress. The escape, The fear, the shock of finding this place, it accelerates the process. You're lying. But even as Elena spoke, cracks were appearing in the edifice of her memories. Faces that should have been clear were blurring. Her mother's voice, which had sustained her through months of torture, sounded suddenly hollow and artificial. Father Meridian gestured to the stained glass windows, and Elena realized the military figures depicted there weren't from any historical conflict she recognized. Their uniforms bore insignia that seemed to shift and change when she looked away. This war you believe you're fighting, this resistance you think you served, it ended 70 years ago. The world moved on, Elena, but some of us saw opportunity in the remnants. The camps weren't prisons, they were laboratories. And you weren't a prisoner of war. The cathedral spun around her as the implications crashed home. What was I? A volunteer initially, though I suspect that particular memory was the first to be excised. Father Meridian reached into his robes and withdrew a tablet, its screen showing medical records that made Elena's blood freeze. Her photograph stared back at her, but the name beneath read Subject 47C, and the date was impossible, 3 years in the future from what she believed to be the current date. Temporal displacement experiments, Father Meridian explained conversationally. We've been quite successful at sending consciousness backward through time, though the process requires extensive memory modification to prevent paradoxes. You volunteered to return to this point, to this moment, though the reasons why have been necessarily obscured. Elena's legs gave out, and she collapsed onto the nearest pew. The wood felt real, solid, but everything else was dissolving around her. What was I supposed to do? Why am I here? Father Meridian's smile revealed teeth that were too sharp, too numerous. You're here to choose, Elena, to remember who you really are and what you came back to prevent. The process can be reversed, your true memories restored, your mission revealed. But the price is everything you believe yourself to be now. He placed the tablet on the altar beside the restraints. Or you can cling to the comfortable lie of Elena Vasquez and watch as history unfolds exactly as it did before. The choice, as always, is yours. The cathedral held its breath as Elena stared at the tablet, her reflection fractured and multiplied in its black screen. The cathedral's doors yielded to Elena's touch with surprising ease, their ancient hinges whispering secrets as they swung inward. She expected the musty scent of abandonment, the chill of neglect. Instead, warmth embraced her, not just physical warmth, but something deeper, almost maternal in its comfort. Candles flickered throughout the vast space, their flames dancing in perfect synchronization, despite the absence of any discernible breeze. The architecture defied logic. Gothic arches soared impossibly high, disappearing into shadows that seemed to breathe and shift. Stained glass windows depicted scenes she couldn't quite focus on. The images appeared to change when she wasn't looking directly at them, transforming from battles to births to something that might have been her own face reflected in fractured light. Elena's bare feet made no sound against the polished stone floor as she moved deeper into the nave. The silence was absolute yet somehow alive, pregnant with anticipation. Row upon row of wooden pews stretched before her, each carved with intricate symbols that tugged at the edges of her memory. She recognized some of them, not from her life before the camp, but from dreams that had haunted her sleep in that concrete hell. At the altar, a figure knelt in prayer. Elena's breath caught in her throat. The woman wore the same grey prison uniform Elena had shed at the river, but it was clean, pressed, somehow transformed into something almost ceremonial. Her dark hair fell in waves across her shoulders, hair that Elena remembered being shorn to stubble. Mira? The name escaped Elena's lips before she could stop it, though she had no memory of knowing anyone by that name. The woman turned, and Elena found herself staring into her own face. Not similar features, not a resemblance that might be explained by coincidence or family relation. It was her face exactly, down to the small scar above the left eyebrow where a guard's baton had struck her 3 months into her imprisonment. "You're late," the other Elena said, rising gracefully from her knees. "Though I suppose time moves differently out there." Elena backed away, her mind reeling. This isn't possible. You're not real. Aren't I? The doppelganger approached with Elena's own measured gait, the slight favor of her left leg where an old injury never quite healed. You escaped the camp, just as you were supposed to. You found the cathedral, just as you were meant to. Everything is proceeding according to design. Design? Elena's voice cracked. What design? Who are you? I'm you, Elena, the you that never left this place. The other woman gestured to encompass the cathedral. The you that's been waiting here for 3 years, 7 months, and 16 days. The you that remembers what you've forgotten. The cathedral seemed to pulse around them, the candlelight growing brighter, the stained glass windows now clearly depicting scenes of violence, not ancient battles but modern warfare. Elena saw images of burning cities, of people in grey uniforms being herded into camps, of herself standing over bodies with blood on her hands. No. Elena shook her head violently. I was a prisoner. I was captured. I'm innocent. Innocent? The other Elena laughed, and the sound echoed strangely in the vast space, multiplying until it became a chorus of mockery. Tell me, Elena, what did you do before the camp? What was your profession? Your crime? Elena opened her mouth to answer and found only emptiness. The memories that should have been there, childhood, family, the events that led to her imprisonment, were absent, leaving only the 3 years and 7 months of concrete walls and cruel guards. You can't remember because those memories were never yours to begin with, her double continued. They belonged to someone else, someone who served her purpose and was discarded. The truth hit Elena like a physical blow. The escape had been too easy. The guards who should have pursued her had been conspicuously absent. The river that should have been watched was unguarded. Even her own body, how had she maintained enough strength to swim after years of meager rations? What am I? Elena whispered. A weapon, the other Elena replied matter-of-factly. A very special kind of weapon, designed to infiltrate, to forget its true nature until activation. The camp was your training ground, your origin story. The suffering was real, it had to be, to make you believe. But it was never random cruelty, it was programming. Elena felt something shifting inside her skull, like tumblers in a lock clicking into place. Images flooded back, not memories of a life before the camp, but instructions, targets, methods of killing so numerous and varied they could have filled libraries. And now? Elena asked, though she was beginning to understand. Now you go back into the world. You find the targets you've been programmed to eliminate. You complete your mission. The other Elena smiled with their shared face. The war is about to begin in earnest, and you, my dear, are going to help us win it. The cathedral began to fade around them, the candles guttering out one by one. Elena's last coherent thought before the programming fully engaged was a desperate hope that somewhere, somehow, the woman she thought she had been might still exist. Then the weapon opened its eyes and walked back into the world. The cathedral's interior stretched impossibly high above her, its vaulted ceiling lost in shadows that seemed to breathe with their own life. Elena's bare feet whispered against polished marble as she stepped deeper into the nave, her prison-issued clothes a stark contrast to the opulent surroundings. Stained glass windows cast fractured rainbows across her skin, each beam of colored light feeling like a benediction she didn't deserve. The silence was absolute, yet somehow alive, as if the very stones were listening to her heartbeat, cataloguing each ragged breath. She had expected decay, abandonment, the hollow echo of forgotten prayers. Instead, the space hummed with an energy that made her teeth ache. Rows of wooden pews stretched toward an altar, draped in white silk, but it was the walls that captured her attention. They were covered in photographs, thousands of them, arranged in perfect geometric patterns that spiraled upward like DNA helixes frozen in silver and sepia. Elena approached the nearest wall, her steps faltering as the images came into focus. Faces, all of them faces she recognized. Her bunkmate Katya smiled from a frame near her shoulder, but this wasn't the hollow-cheeked woman Elena remembered from the camp. This Katya was younger, healthier, wearing a white coat and standing beside sophisticated laboratory equipment. Below her, Marcus, the gentle giant who had shared his meager bread rations, appeared in military dress uniform, medals gleaming on his chest, shaking hands with officials Elena didn't recognize, but whose faces radiated authority. She stumbled backward, her vision blurring. The photographs seemed to pulse, reorganizing themselves before her eyes. There was Dmitri, the camp's most broken prisoner, the one who spoke to shadows and wept in his sleep. But in this image, he wore an expensive suit, signing documents at a mahogany table, while men in dark glasses watched approvingly. "Suno," she whispered, the word echoing through the cathedral like a gunshot. "This is wrong." But her eyes were already seeking the next image, and the next. Every prisoner she had known, had suffered alongside, had watched die. They were all here. All of them young and clean and whole, posed in settings that spoke of education, privilege, purpose. The contradictions crashed against her memory like waves against a crumbling seawall. Her legs gave out when she found herself. The photograph was larger than the others, positioned at eye level in an ornate golden frame. Elena stared at her own face, unmarked by the scar that now traced her jawline, her hair lustrous and long instead of the brittle stubble she now wore. She was standing in what looked like a lecture hall, pointing at a projection screen covered in complex mathematical equations. Students filled the seats before her, their faces attentive, eager. The brass nameplate below the frame read, "Dr. Elena Vasquez, Cognitive Psychology, Project Tabula Rasa." The cathedral spun around her. She pressed her palms against the cool marble floor, fighting the urge to vomit. Project Tabula Rasa. The words felt familiar on her tongue, like a half-remembered lullaby or the ghost of a name called in dreams. "You're beginning to remember." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating through the stone until it seemed to originate from within her own skull. Elena scrambled to her feet, searching the shadows between the pillars. "Who's there?" Her voice cracked like thin ice. "Show yourself." A figure emerged from behind the altar, moving with measured steps that echoed through the cathedral like a funeral march. It was a woman, elderly but straight-backed, wearing simple black robes that seemed to absorb the colored light from the windows. Her face was kind but weathered, marked by the sort of lines that spoke of difficult decisions and sleepless nights. "My name is Sister Margaret," the woman said, her voice carrying a slight accent Elena couldn't place. "Though I suspect you remember me by a different name, or perhaps you remember nothing at all. The process was designed to be thorough." "What process?" Elena's hand went instinctively to the scar on her jaw, a nervous habit she'd developed in the camp. "What is this place? Those photographs, they can't be real." Sister Margaret's smile was infinitely sad. "Can't they? Look again, Elena. Not with your eyes. They've been trained to see only what serves the story you've been told. Look with the part of your mind that dreams, that remembers the taste of coffee in a blue ceramic mug, the weight of a pen in your fingers as you wrote equations that could reshape human consciousness." The words hit Elena like physical blows. Blue ceramic mug. She could taste the coffee suddenly, rich and bitter, nothing like the grey water they'd been given in the camp. Her right hand twitched, fingers curling as if around a phantom pen. "No," she said, but the word lacked conviction. "I was captured. I was in prison. The war—" "There is no war, Elena," Sister Margaret said gently. "There never was. The war exists only in the minds of those who needed to forget who they really are." The cathedral walls seemed to close in around her as the implications crashed down like falling stone. Elena sank to her knees, staring at her own impossibly young face in the golden frame, trying to reconcile the stranger in the photograph with the broken prisoner she believed herself to be. Everything she knew was a lie. The cathedral's main hall stretched before Elena like a cavern carved from marble and shadow. Towering columns disappeared into darkness above, their surfaces etched with symbols that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. The air tasted of incense and something else, something metallic that made her stomach clench with recognition. She moved carefully between the pews, her bare feet silent on the cold stone floor. The silence here felt different from the oppressive quiet of the camp. This was expectant, as if the very walls were holding their breath. At the altar, she found what had been calling to her since she'd first glimpsed the spires through the forest canopy. A massive book lay open, its pages yellowed with age but somehow still luminous in the dim light filtering through the stained glass windows. The text was written in a script she shouldn't have been able to read, yet the words flowed into her mind as naturally as breathing. The Anamnesis Project, subject 847, classification, high priority. Elena's hands trembled as she turned the page. A photograph stared back at her, her own face but younger, wearing clothes she didn't remember owning. Below it, typed notes in clinical prose that made her blood run cold. Memory suppression successful. Subject exhibits complete dissociation from previous identity. Recommend advancing to phase 3 of personality reconstruction. She flipped backward, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. More photos, more faces, some familiar from the camp, others complete strangers, all wearing the same vacant expression she recognized from her own reflection in the prison mirrors. You weren't supposed to find this so quickly. Elena spun around, nearly knocking over a candle stand. A woman emerged from the shadows between the columns, tall, elegant, wearing a white coat over simple grey clothes. Her silver hair was pulled back severely, and her pale eyes held a mixture of disappointment and curiosity. Dr. Kellner. The name escaped Elena's lips without conscious thought, bringing with it a flood of fragmentary images. A sterile room, needles, her own voice begging for something she couldn't quite remember. Very good. Your neural pathways are reasserting themselves faster than our models predicted. The doctor stepped closer, her hands clasped behind her back in a gesture that triggered another wave of unwelcome familiarity. Though I suppose we should have expected that. You always were our most resilient subject. Subject? Elena backed against the altar, her fingers gripping the edge of the ancient book. What did you do to me? What we did to all of them. What the war required us to do. Dr. Kellner gestured to the pews around them, and Elena realized with horror that they weren't empty. Dozens of people sat motionless in the shadows, their eyes open but unseeing, their faces slack with the same emptiness she'd witnessed in the camp. You were all volunteers once, you know. Soldiers who believed in the cause so deeply you were willing to sacrifice everything, even your own memories, to serve it. The book fell open to another page, revealing a map marked with locations across 3 continents. Red pins clustered around major cities, each one labeled with numbers that meant nothing to Elena but seemed to please Dr. Kellner when she noticed them. The camps were never about imprisonment, the doctor continued, moving to study the map over Elena's shoulder. They were about preparation. We needed you to believe you were victims, to develop the proper emotional responses, the survival instincts, the unshakable conviction that you were fighting against oppression rather than for it. Elena's legs gave out, and she sank onto the altar steps. You're lying. The Cathedral has been our primary research facility for 7 years, hidden in plain sight, just as we trained you to do. Each of you will return to your designated targets with perfect cover stories, escaped prisoners seeking justice, refugees with nothing left to lose. Who would suspect someone who suffered so much of being anything other than a victim? The doctor knelt beside her, her voice taking on an almost maternal tone. The memory blocks weren't meant to be permanent, dear. They'll continue dissolving over the next few weeks. You'll remember your real name, your training, your mission. And more importantly, you'll remember why you volunteered for this in the first place. Elena stared at the map, at the red pins marking cities she'd never visited but somehow knew intimately. The others in the camp will escape over the next few months, following carefully planned routes to their assignments. You were simply the first to be activated. Dr. Kellner stood, brushing dust from her coat. Though your early awakening is concerning, we may need to adjust your programming before deployment. No. Elena pushed herself to her feet, surprising them both with the steadiness in her voice. I won't go back. Dr. Kellner's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Oh, my dear girl, you still don't understand, do you? You never left." The cathedral bells began to toll, their deep bronze voices echoing off stone walls, and Elena realized that the sound wasn't coming from above. It was rising from somewhere far below, from depths she'd forgotten she knew existed. The cathedral's silence pressed against Elena's eardrums as she descended the spiral staircase, each stone step worn smooth by centuries of passage. The temperature dropped with every turn, and the air grew thick with the scent of old parchment and something else, something medicinal that made her stomach clench. At the bottom, a heavy wooden door stood ajar, revealing a corridor lined with electric lights that hummed softly in the darkness. The modern fixtures seemed obscene against the ancient stonework, like surgical instruments laid out on an altar. Elena pushed through the door and found herself in what could only be described as a laboratory. Sterile white tables stretched across the vaulted chamber, covered with equipment she didn't recognize. Glass tubes filled with viscous liquids, metal boxes with blinking displays, and charts covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. But it was the photographs lining the walls that made her legs nearly buckle. Hundreds of faces stared back at her from the mounted pictures. Men, women, children, all with the same hollow expression she'd seen in her fellow prisoners. Below each photograph was a series of numbers and letters that meant nothing to her, but the red stamps across many of them were clear enough: terminated. Her own face smiled back at her from a frame near the center of the wall. Elena stumbled forward, her hand trembling, as she reached toward the photograph. It showed her younger, healthier, wearing a white coat and standing beside a man she didn't recognize. The placard beneath read, "Dr. Elena Vasquez, Project Lazarus, status active. You're remembering." Elena spun around to find a woman emerging from the shadows between the laboratory tables. She was tall and elegant, with silver hair pulled back severely and eyes the color of winter sky. Elena knew that face, knew it with a certainty that made her chest tight with panic. "Dr. Hartwell," Elena whispered, though she couldn't remember why that name came so easily to her lips. "Very good. The neural pathways are reasserting themselves faster than we predicted." Dr. Hartwell moved closer, her heels clicking against the stone floor. "Though I must say, your escape was rather theatrical. We had expected you to simply walk through the front gate when the conditioning broke down." Elena backed away until her shoulders hit the wall of photographs. "I don't understand. The prison camp, the war—" "There is no war, Elena. There hasn't been for 3 years. Dr. Hartwell picked up a tablet from one of the tables and swiped through several screens. "What you experienced was a carefully constructed environment designed to stress-test the conditioning protocols. Quite successful, actually, until your recent breakthrough." The room seemed to tilt around Elena. "That's impossible. The guards, the other prisoners—" "All volunteers from our research program. Well, mostly volunteers." Dr. Hartwell's smile was clinical, detached. "The guards were actors, of course, very committed to their roles. As for your fellow prisoners, they were subjects like yourself, individuals who had volunteered for memory modification in exchange for substantial compensation, or who had been deemed suitable candidates through other channels." Elena's legs gave out, and she slid down the wall until she was sitting on the cold stone floor. "Volunteered for what?" "Project Lazarus, the development of selective memory reconstruction technology." Dr. Hartwell crouched down to Elena's eye level, studying her face with scientific interest. "You were our lead researcher, actually. Quite brilliant. You helped design the very procedures that were used on you." The words hit Elena like physical blows. Images flashed through her mind, not memories exactly, but fragments. A laboratory much like this one, her hands working with delicate instruments, charts and graphs showing brain activity patterns, and Dr. Hartwell always watching, always taking notes. "Why?" Elena's voice was barely audible. "Because you discovered something you shouldn't have, about the true applications of the technology, about who was funding our research." Dr. Hartwell stood and walked to a filing cabinet, withdrawing a thick folder. "You threatened to go public, said the technology was being weaponized, that innocent people were being used as test subjects without their knowledge or consent." She dropped the folder beside Elena. The tab read, "Subject 247E, Vasquez Elena. We gave you a choice. Submit to the memory modification voluntarily, or face rather unpleasant legal consequences for violating your confidentiality agreements. You chose the procedure." Elena stared at the folder, afraid to open it. "And the others in the camp?" Some were willing participants who knew exactly what they were signing up for. Others were criminals given the option of participating instead of serving prison sentences. A few were acquired through less conventional means. Dr. Hartwell's tone remained maddeningly calm, all in service of perfecting a technology that will revolutionize how we treat trauma, addiction, and mental illness. By stealing people's lives? By giving them new ones, better ones. Dr. Hartwell moved to a control panel and began pressing buttons. "Now, we need to discuss your future, Elena. Your breakthrough has provided valuable data, but it's also created a problem that needs to be resolved." The laboratory door slammed shut with a heavy metallic click that echoed through the ancient chamber like a death knell. The cathedral's silence pressed against Elena's eardrums like deep water. She stood frozen in the nave, her eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through stained glass windows that depicted scenes she didn't recognize. Figures in military uniforms kneeling before altars, children with hollow eyes reaching toward distant stars, and in the center panel, a woman who looked disturbingly familiar, raising her hands toward a burning sky. Her bare feet moved soundlessly across the cold stone floor as she approached the altar. The air here felt different, charged with something that made her skin prickle. Behind the ornate crucifix, she noticed an inconsistency in the wall S stonework, a seam barely visible unless viewed from this exact angle. Elena pressed her palm against the stone, and a section swung inward with a soft pneumatic hiss. The passage beyond was lit by harsh fluorescent lights that made her squint after the cathedral's gloom. The walls were lined with metal, industrial and cold, completely at odds with the medieval facade above. Her heart hammered as she descended a spiral staircase that seemed to burrow deep into the earth. The first room she encountered took her breath away. Dozens of monitors lined the walls, each displaying feeds from security cameras. She recognized some of the locations immediately: the prison camp's exercise yard, the mess hall where she'd choked down countless bowls of thin gruel, the isolation cells where prisoners disappeared for weeks at a time. But there were other feeds too: suburban homes with families eating dinner, office buildings where people worked late into the night, schools where children played in courtyards, all of them marked with small red dots in the corner of the screen, and beneath each feed a series of numbers that made her stomach lurch. Coordinates, she realized. You weren't supposed to see this yet. Elena spun around, her body tensing for flight, but the voice belonged to someone she recognized. Dr. Sarah Chen stood in the doorway, no longer wearing the simple clothes of a fellow prisoner. Instead, she was dressed in a crisp military uniform with insignia Elena didn't recognize. "Sarah?" Elena's voice cracked. "What are you doing here?" "The same thing I was doing in the camp. My job." Sarah stepped into the room, and Elena noticed she moved differently now, confident, predatory. "Though I have to admit, you've exceeded every projection we made about your capabilities." "Projections?" Elena backed toward the monitors, her mind racing to make sense of what she was seeing. "You were a prisoner. We talked about escape. You helped me. I guided you." Sarah's smile held no warmth. Every conversation, every piece of advice, every moment of supposed solidarity was designed to push you in exactly this direction, to see if you could make it here. Elena's legs felt weak. "You're one of them. There is no them, Elena. There's only us. And whether you realize it or not, you're part of this too." Sarah gestured to one of the monitors. "Do you see that feed? Building 7, northwest corner? That's where you worked before your arrest. marketing coordinator for Pinnacle Industries. The image on the screen showed a sterile office building, but as Elena watched, the view shifted to show an interior space filled with people in white coats working over tables covered in what looked like architectural models. But these weren't buildings, they were scaled replicas of camps, dozens of them. Pinnacle was a front, Sarah continued, her voice taking on the tone of a patient teacher. You were never just a marketing coordinator. You were part of the design team that helped create the psychological profile system we used to select candidates. That's impossible. I would remember. Memory is more fragile than people think, especially when it's been carefully edited. Sarah pulled a tablet from a wall mount and swiped through several screens. Elena Vasquez, subject 447, recruited at age 23 through a fabricated job posting, worked on Project Cathedral for 18 months before experiencing what our psychologists called ethical breakdown. Rather than eliminate a valuable asset, we decided to test whether your own systems could be used on their creator. Elena stared at the tablet screen, which displayed detailed psychological evaluations, brain scans and reports written in her own handwriting, documents she had no memory of creating. Her signature appeared dozens of times, authorizing procedures, approving modifications to something called the Integration Protocol. The prison camp was your final exam, Sarah said. We needed to know if someone with your specific knowledge could escape our systems if their memories of creating them were suppressed. Congratulations. You passed with flying colors. Don't believe you. But even as Elena said the words, fragments of memory were beginning to surface. A laboratory, faces of colleagues discussing the moral implications of their work, her own voice arguing passionately against something, though she couldn't remember what. Sarah set the tablet aside and moved closer. The war you thought you were fighting, the resistance you believed you were part of, they exist, but not the way you think. And now that you've proven our methods work even on their creators, it's time to discuss your real purpose here. Through the monitor feeds, Elena watched as small red lights began blinking in building after building, city after city, like a constellation of targets spreading across the world. The silence in the cathedral felt alive, pressing against Elena's skin like a second atmosphere. She stood frozen at the threshold, her eyes adjusting to the dim interior where countless candles flickered against towering stone pillars. The scent of incense mixed with something else, something metallic and wrong. Father Matthias stepped past her, his robes rustling against the marble floor. "Welcome home, Elena." The words hit her like ice water. Home. She'd never been here before, yet something about the vaulted ceilings and stained glass windows felt disturbingly familiar. The way shadows fell across the nave, the pattern of the floor beneath her feet, it was as if she'd walked these halls in dreams she couldn't quite remember. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice echoing in the vast space. "Of course you don't." They made sure of that. Matthias moved toward the altar, where dozens of photographs were arranged in neat rows. The conditioning was quite thorough. Dr. Volkov was always proud of his work. Elena's blood turned to ice. She knew that name, had heard it whispered in the camp's medical wing, spoken with a mixture of fear and reverence by the guards. But how could this priest know about the doctor's experiments? She forced her legs to move, following Matthias deeper into the cathedral. As they approached the altar, the photographs became clearer. Her breath caught in her throat. They were all of her, dozens of images spanning what looked like years. Elena as a child in a white dress, standing in this very cathedral. Elena older, perhaps 15, her hair longer but her eyes already holding that hollow look she recognized from the mirror. "This isn't possible," she breathed. "I've never been here before." "Haven't you?" Matthias turned to face her, and in the candlelight, his features seemed different somehow. Sharper, more predatory. "Tell me, Elena, what do you remember about your life before the camp?" She opened her mouth to answer, then stopped. The question hung in the air like a challenge, and she realized with growing horror that she couldn't respond. Her memories before the camp were fragments, disconnected images that felt more like scenes from someone else's life than her own experiences. "I remember my parents," she said slowly, testing the words. "They died in the bombing of Prague. I was arrested for—" The words died in her throat. Arrested for what? Why couldn't she remember? Matthias nodded sadly. "The memory conditioning. It's wearing off now that you're away from the regular treatments. Dr. Volkov always said the effects would fade without maintenance." "What treatments?" But even as she asked, Elena's hand moved instinctively to the base of her skull, where a small scar had always been. She'd been told it was from shrapnel during the bombing that killed her parents, but now she wondered. "You were never a prisoner, Elena. You were a subject." Matthias moved to stand beside the altar, his hand resting on an ornate golden cross. Project Tabula Rasa, the blank slate initiative. The goal was to create perfect operatives by erasing their original personalities and implanting new ones. The cathedral seemed to spin around her. Elena gripped the edge of a pew to steady herself as fragmented memories began surfacing like debris from a shipwreck, a laboratory, electrodes attached to her temples, needles filled with cloudy liquid, and through it all, a man in a white coat taking notes. Dr. Volkov. But the escape, she gasped. "Marcus helped me. The guards chasing us." All carefully orchestrated. You needed to believe you had broken free, that your actions were your own choice. It made the conditioning more effective. Matthias's voice carried no emotion, as if he were discussing the weather. "Marcus was one of ours, of course. His death was unfortunate, but necessary for authenticity." Elena felt something break inside her chest. Marcus, who had died protecting her, who had whispered words of love as his life bled out onto the forest floor, he had been part of the lie. Everything had been a lie. "What did you do to me?" she whispered. "We gave you purpose," Matthias replied. "The girl you were before, she was weak, frightened, useless to the cause. We made you into something better, a weapon with a human face." "What cause?" The words came out as a snarl. For the first time, Matthias smiled, and Elena saw genuine warmth in his expression. "The only cause that matters. Victory. The war isn't what you think it is, Elena. The real battle isn't between nations. It's between those who would preserve the old world and those brave enough to build a new one." He gestured toward the shadows beyond the altar, where Elena now noticed figures emerging. Men and women in dark clothing, their faces hidden but their movements coordinated, predatory. "And you, my dear child, are going to help us win it." Elena's hand moved toward the knife at her belt, but she already knew it was too late. The cathedral had become a trap, and she was exactly where they wanted her to be. The stone steps descended into absolute darkness, each footfall echoing like a gunshot in the cathedral's hidden depths. Elena pressed her hand against the cold wall, feeling the rough-hewn blocks guide her downward into what felt like the earth's very bowels. The air grew thicker with each step, heavy with the scent of ancient stone and something else, something organic and unsettling. When the steps finally leveled out, Elena found herself in a corridor lit by the same ethereal blue glow that had emanated from the altar above. The light seemed to pulse from within the walls themselves, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that made her skin crawl. She moved forward cautiously, her bare feet silent on the smooth floor. The corridor opened into a vast underground chamber that took her breath away. The ceiling arched high overhead, supported by massive pillars carved with the same intricate symbols she'd seen throughout the cathedral. But it wasn't the architecture that stopped her cold, it was what filled the space. Dozens of glass pods lined the chamber in perfect rows, each one roughly the size of a coffin and filled with the same blue luminescent fluid. Most were empty, their transparent surfaces gleaming under the strange light, but several contained human forms, suspended in the glowing liquid like specimens in some nightmarish laboratory. Elena approached the nearest occupied pod with trembling steps. Inside floated a woman who looked to be in her 30s, her dark hair streaming around her peaceful face. Tubes and wires connected her body to the pod's mechanisms, and her chest rose and fell in a slow, rhythmic pattern. She was alive but clearly unconscious. Moving to the next pod, Elena's blood turned to ice. The face looking back at her was her own. She stumbled backward, her mind reeling. The woman in the pod was identical to her in every way, the same auburn hair, the same scar above the left eyebrow from a childhood fall, even the same small birthmark on her shoulder. But this other Elena looked younger somehow, unmarked by the horrors of the prison camp. Beautiful work, isn't it? Elena spun around to find Dr. Kozlov emerging from the shadows between the pillars. He wore the same white coat from the camp, but here in this ethereal blue light, he looked less like a prison doctor and more like some otherworldly being. "What is this place?" Elena's voice came out as barely a whisper. "The future," Kozlov replied, approaching with measured steps. "And the past, and the present, all existing simultaneously." He gestured toward the pods with obvious pride. "This is where we perfect humanity, where we create beings capable of surviving what's coming." Elena backed away from him, her eyes darting between the pods and the doctor. "These people, what did you do to them?" "We saved them," Kozlov said simply. "Every person you see here volunteered for the program, though they may not remember it that way. Memory, you see, is remarkably malleable. We can edit experiences, implant new ones, create entire histories that feel completely real to the subject." The implications hit Elena like a physical blow. The war, my capture, carefully constructed scenarios designed to test psychological resilience under extreme stress. Kozlov nodded approvingly. "You performed admirably, Elena. Better than most of your iterations." "Iterations?" The word felt foreign on her tongue. Kozlov moved to a control panel near the wall, his fingers dancing over the strange symbols. The blue light in the chamber pulsed brighter, and Elena could see more clearly into the distant corners. There, in the shadows, stood more pods, many more. "You are Prototype 7, Kozlov explained conversationally. "The others, well, they didn't survive the testing phase. But you, Elena 7, you've exceeded all expectations. Your escape from the camp, your navigation of the psychological maze we created, it's all been extraordinary." Elena felt reality crumbling around her like sand. "Everything I remember?" "Oh, the memories are real enough to you," Kozlov assured her. "Pain is pain, whether it happens in what you call reality or in the constructed environments we create. Your suffering was genuine, which is what made it so valuable as a testing mechanism." She looked again at the woman in the pod who wore her face. "Then, who is she?" "Elena Prime, the original template from which you were grown. She's been sleeping here for 3 years while we've tested her copies." Kozlov's eyes gleamed with scientific fervor. "You see, the world above is dying, Elena. War, disease, environmental collapse. Humanity needs to evolve or perish. We're creating enhanced humans, beings capable of surviving in the new world, but first we must test them thoroughly." The chamber suddenly felt smaller, the air thinner. Elena realized she was hyperventilating and forced herself to slow her breathing. "Enhanced how?" "Increased physical resilience, enhanced problem-solving capabilities, improved stress tolerance," Kozlov listed proudly. "And most importantly, the ability to be reprogrammed as needed. Perfect soldiers, perfect workers, perfect citizens for the new order." Elena's hand went instinctively to her chest, feeling her heart pound against her ribs. "What happens to me now?" Kozlov smiled, and in that expression, Elena saw her death sentence written in the blue glow of his eyes. The cathedral's silence pressed against Elena's eardrums as she descended the spiral staircase, each stone step worn smooth by centuries of footfalls. The phosphorescent symbols carved into the walls grew brighter as she moved deeper, casting an eerie blue-green glow that made her skin look corpse-pale. Father Matthias had vanished into the shadows above, leaving her with only cryptic warnings about what lay beneath. The air grew thicker, carrying a metallic taste that reminded her of blood and copper wiring. Somewhere in the darkness below, machinery hummed with a rhythm that felt almost organic, like a massive heartbeat. At the bottom of the stairs, Elena found herself facing a circular chamber carved from black stone. The walls were lined with what looked like viewing windows, each one dark and empty. In the center of the room stood a cylindrical platform, its surface covered in the same glowing symbols she'd seen throughout the cathedral. She approached cautiously, her bare feet silent on the cold floor. As she drew closer, the symbols began to pulse faster, responding to her presence. A low vibration started in the floor, traveling up through her bones. "You remember this place?" Elena spun around. A woman emerged from an alcove she hadn't noticed, tall and elegant with silver hair pulled back severely. She wore the same grey uniform Elena had seen in her fragmented memories, but with insignia that marked her as someone of high rank. "Dr. Kessler," Elena whispered, the name surfacing from depths she didn't know existed in her mind. "Very good. The neural pathways are still intact, despite the trauma." Dr. Kessler moved with predatory grace, circling the platform. "Do you remember what we accomplished here? What you helped us accomplish?" Elena's head throbbed as images flashed behind her eyes. Herself, younger, wearing a white lab coat, her hands operating complex machinery, people, prisoners, lying motionless on tables while she worked. The taste of bile rose in her throat. "No, that wasn't me. I was a prisoner. I escaped from Laboratory 7, yes. But that was later, after the conditioning began to break down." Dr. Kessler's voice carried a note of maternal disappointment. "You were brilliant once, Elena, my finest protégée. You helped design the process that created perfect soldiers from broken minds." The viewing windows suddenly blazed with light. Behind each one, Elena could see figures standing motionless, men and women with vacant eyes and perfect posture. They wore uniforms from different nations, different wars. Some looked like they'd been standing there for decades. "Your fellow researchers," Dr. Kessler explained. "When their usefulness ended, they became test subjects themselves, full circle as it were." Elena staggered backward, her mind reeling. The memories were coming faster now, unbidden and unwelcome. She saw herself injecting serums into prisoners' spines, monitoring their vital signs as their personalities dissolved, writing detailed reports on the optimization of human will. "The war isn't what you think it is," Dr. Kessler continued. "There are no sides anymore, just resources to be managed. The cathedral serves those who understand that chaos must be controlled, that free will is humanity's greatest weakness." "You're lying." Elena's voice cracked. "I would never—" "You volunteered, Elena. You came to us eager to reshape the world." Dr. Kessler touched a control panel hidden in the wall, and the platform began to descend into the floor. Beneath it lay a surgical chair surrounded by gleaming instruments. "You believed so fervently that suffering could be eliminated by eliminating choice." The chair was stained with old blood. Elena's blood, she realized with horror. She could remember lying there, feeling the needles pierce her skull as her own creation was turned against her. The irony wasn't lost on Dr. Kessler, whose smile held genuine amusement. "Why?" Elena's legs gave out and she collapsed to her knees. "Why did you do this to me?" "Because you began to doubt. You started asking questions about the broader application of our work, expressing concern about consent and human rights." Dr. Kessler's tone suggested she was discussing a minor personality flaw. "We couldn't allow that kind of thinking to spread, but your knowledge was too valuable to simply discard you." The chamber's walls began to shift, revealing more equipment, more holding cells. Elena realized the entire cathedral was a facade built around this underground complex. How many others were trapped here? How many had she helped put in those cells? "The escape was planned," Dr. Kessler said. "We needed to see how well the reconditioning held under stress. You've exceeded our expectations." Elena's hand found the knife she'd taken from Father Matthias. The blade felt impossibly heavy in her grip. Around her, the machinery continued its patient humming, waiting to reclaim her. "There's nowhere to run this time," Dr. Kessler observed. "But then, you know that. You helped design the security protocols." As if summoned by her words, figures began emerging from the shadows. the blank-eyed soldiers Elena had seen in the viewing windows, moving with mechanical precision toward their former creator. The confession booth's mahogany walls seemed to pulse with Elena's heartbeat as Father Marcus continued speaking through the carved screen between them. His voice carried the weight of decades, each word measured and deliberate. Your mother didn't die in the bombing, Elena. She was taken the same night you were, but to a different facility, one designed for a very specific purpose. Elena's fingers dug into the worn velvet of the kneeler. What purpose? To extract information from those who knew about Project Memoria. Your mother was Dr. Sarah Chen, head researcher on memory modification protocols. The woman who raised you, the one you remember as your mother, was carefully selected to match certain physical characteristics. The world tilted. Elena gripped the confessional's edge, fighting waves of nausea. That's impossible. I remember constructed memories, layered over your original experiences with surgical precision. Your mother's work made it possible, though she never intended it to be used this way. Through the screen's lattice, Elena could see the shadow of Father Marcus leaning forward. The war, you remember, the resistance movement, even your capture, none of it happened the way you think it did. Stop! Elena's whisper cut through the dim space. Just stop! But he continued, relentless in his revelation. You were part of the original test group, Elena. Children whose memories could be more easily manipulated. The Cathedral, this entire compound, exists to house subjects like you while researchers perfect the process. Elena shot to her feet, the confessional suddenly suffocating. She fumbled for the door handle, but Father Marcus's voice held her frozen. Your real name is Subject 847, Elena Chen. You've been here for 7 years, not 3 months in that prison camp. Every time you remember escaping, it's because they've allowed you to discover this place again. This is your 16th cycle through the protocol. The door wouldn't open. Elena yanked at the handle, panic rising in her throat. Let me out! The memories are breaking down because your mind is fighting back. Dr. Reeves, the woman you saw earlier, she's been documenting your increasing resistance to the modifications. That's why you're experiencing flashes of other timelines, other versions of these events. Elena pressed her back against the door, sliding down until she sat huddled on the floor. The fragments she'd been experiencing suddenly clicked into place like puzzle pieces finding their homes. The feeling of déjà vu in the sanctuary, the guard who'd seemed to recognize her, her inexplicable knowledge of the cathedral's layout. The other subjects, she managed to say, in the pews during Mass, they're like me. Some are volunteers who've undergone the procedure willingly. Others, like you, are test cases. The goal is to create perfect sleeper agents, individuals who can be given entirely fabricated histories and identities, then activated when needed. A new horror crept up Elena's spine. What happens when the cycles stop working? When someone's mind can't be reset anymore? Silence stretched between them before Father Marcus answered. There's a reason the subject roster never grows beyond 50. Elena closed her eyes, trying to separate real memories from manufactured ones, but everything felt equally vivid, equally true. The taste of prison rations, her mother's lullabies, the weight of the rifle during training exercises, learning to braid her hair as a child. How do I know you're telling me the truth? She asked. How do I know this isn't just another layer of the conditioning? Because I'm not supposed to be talking to you. Because Dr. Reeves doesn't know I've retained my original memories despite their attempts to modify them. And because tomorrow morning, they're scheduled to terminate your cycle permanently. Elena's eyes snapped open. What? Your resistance has grown too strong. Dr. Reeves convinced the Oversight Committee that you're no longer a viable test subject. The procedure is scheduled for 0800 hours. The confession booth suddenly felt like a tomb. Elena pressed her palms against her temples, trying to think through the chaos in her mind. If what you're saying is true, if you've kept your memories, then you can help me get out of here. Really get out this time. The cathedral sits in the middle of a government facility, Elena. There is no out, but there might be another option. She looked up at the shadow beyond the screen. What kind of option? Dr. Reeves keeps backup drives of all the original memory files in her private office, including yours. If we could retrieve them and restore your authentic memories, you might be able to resist the termination procedure long enough to expose what's happening here. And if we're caught, they'll simply move up the timeline. But Elena, Father Marcus paused and she heard him shift in his seat. There's something else you need to know about why they chose you specifically. Something about your mother's research that made you particularly valuable to them. Elena stood slowly, her legs shaking but her resolve hardening. Whatever truth waited in those files, whatever the cost of learning who she really was, it had to be better than this maze of false memories and endless cycles. Tell me what we need to do. The narrow passage twisted deeper into the cathedral's foundations, each step taking Elena further from the world above. The walls here were different, older stone, rougher hewn, as if this section predated the magnificent structure overhead by centuries. Her fingers traced along the cold surface, following the carved symbols that seemed to pulse with meaning just beyond her comprehension. Dr. Voss moved ahead with surprising agility for his age, his lamp casting dancing shadows that made the corridor seem alive. Behind them, the sound of pursuit had faded, but Elena knew it was temporary. They would find the hidden entrance soon enough. "How long have you known?" she asked, her voice echoing off the ancient walls. "About what I am?" "Since the moment they brought you to the camp," Voss replied without turning. "Your blood work was unique, the genetic markers we've been searching for decades to find. You are perhaps the last of your bloodline, Elena, the last key." The passage opened into a vast underground chamber that took Elena's breath away. The ceiling soared overhead, supported by massive pillars carved with the same symbols she'd seen throughout the cathedral. But it was what stood in the center that made her stumble backward in shock. A tree, but not just any tree, something ancient and impossible, its silver bark gleaming in the lamplight, its branches reaching toward the stone ceiling far above. The roots spread across the chamber floor in intricate patterns, and where they touched the stone, that same ethereal light pulsed gently. "The heart tree," Voss whispered, his voice filled with reverence. "The source of everything. The reason for the war, the camps, the experiments. All of it led to this moment." Elena approached slowly, drawn by something she couldn't name. The tree seemed to hum with energy, and as she drew closer, the brand on her shoulder began to burn, not with pain, but with a warm, welcoming fire. "I don't understand," she said, reaching out toward the silver bark. "What does this have to do with me?" "Your ancestors were its guardians," Voss explained, setting down his lamp and pulling out what looked like an ancient journal. "For generations, your bloodline protected the tree's secret. But during the war, when the old knowledge was being destroyed, your grandmother made a choice. She hid the tree here, beneath the cathedral, and scattered the keys." Keys? Genetic markers, memories, the ability to commune with the tree itself. He gestured toward her brand. "That mark isn't just a prison tattoo, Elena, it's a seal, a lock that only your touch can open." Elena's hand hovered inches from the bark. She could feel something stirring beneath the surface, like a vast consciousness awakening from long slumber. "What happens if I touch it?" "The truth," Voss said simply. "All of it. Why the war really started, what they were truly fighting for, and what you must choose to do with that knowledge." Footsteps echoed from the passage behind them. Their pursuers had found the way down. "Elena!" Commander Reich's voice boomed through the chamber. "Step away from the tree, you don't know what you're dealing with." She spun around to see armed guards flooding into the chamber, their weapons trained on her and Voss. Reich stood among them, but his expression wasn't one of triumph, it was fear. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with," Elena called back, her hand still poised near the tree. "The question is, do you?" "That tree is a weapon," Reich said, taking a careful step forward. "The old regime was going to use it to remake the world, to wipe clean entire populations and start fresh. Your grandmother helped us hide it to prevent that catastrophe. Elena looked between Risch and Voss, confusion swirling in her mind. Who's telling the truth? Both of us, Voss said quietly. The tree has that power, but it also has the power to heal, to restore what was lost. The choice of how to use it belongs to you. No choice at all, Risch countered. Some powers are too dangerous to exist. Touch that tree, and you'll unleash forces beyond your control. The silver bark seemed to pulse with anticipation. Elena could feel memories stirring at the edge of her consciousness, not her own memories, but older ones passed down through generations. Images of green forests stretching endlessly, of cities that hummed with life, of a world before the wars, before the camps, before everything went wrong. She thought of Marcus, dying in the snow, of the countless prisoners who never made it out of the camps, of Dr. Voss, who had risked everything to show her this truth, of Risch, whose fear might be justified, or might be the fear of losing control. The brand on her shoulder flared with warmth, and Elena realized the choice had never really been hers to make. Some paths, once begun, could only lead to one destination. She pressed her palm against the silver bark. The world exploded into light. The ancient stone steps descended into darkness beneath the cathedral's foundation, each footfall echoing like a heartbeat in the narrow stairwell. Elena's fingers traced the cold wall as she followed the hooded figure deeper underground, her mind reeling from everything she'd discovered in the sanctuary above. "Where are you taking me?" she whispered, but the figure remained silent. The air grew warmer as they descended, carrying the scent of burning candles and something else, something clinical that reminded her uncomfortably of the camp's medical facility. Her stomach clenched as memories of Dr. Hoffman's experiments threatened to surface. They emerged into a vast underground chamber, its vaulted ceiling supported by massive stone pillars. But this wasn't another religious space. Banks of monitors lined the walls, their blue glow casting eerie shadows across rows of metal tables and medical equipment. The juxtaposition was jarring, medieval architecture housing modern technology that looked decades ahead of anything she'd seen. "Welcome to the real cathedral," the figure said, finally pushing back her hood to reveal Dr. Sarah Chen, the woman whose face Elena had seen in the photographs upstairs. But this wasn't the young researcher from the pictures. This woman was older, bearing lines of exhaustion and something deeper, guilt perhaps or regret. "You're supposed to be dead," Elena said, instinctively backing toward the stairs. "Death is a useful fiction when you're trying to disappear." Dr. Chen moved to one of the monitors, her fingers dancing across a keyboard. "Just like your identity was a useful fiction when they needed someone to test the final phase." The screens flickered to life, displaying images that made Elena's blood freeze. Aerial shots of the prison camp, but not as she'd known it. These showed the facility as it truly was. Not a detention center, but a research installation. The prisoners weren't political dissidents or criminals, they were test subjects. "The war ended 6 months before you arrived at the camp," Dr. Chen continued, her voice clinical and detached. "Everything that happened to you there was part of something else entirely." Elena stared at surveillance footage of herself in various scenarios she didn't remember, walking through different sections of the camp, speaking with people whose faces were blank in her memory, participating in activities that seemed normal but felt wrong when viewed from above. "The memory suppression worked better than we hoped," Dr. Chen said. "Too well, in some cases. You've been living in a carefully constructed reality for 2 years." "That's impossible." But even as Elena spoke the words, fragments began surfacing, inconsistencies she'd dismissed, conversations that had seemed strange, the way certain guards had looked at her, not with cruelty but with something like pity. Project Cathedral was designed to explore memory manipulation and identity reconstruction. The goal was to create the perfect soldier, someone who could be given any background, any motivation, any purpose, and believe it completely. Dr. Chen pulled up another file, this one showing brain scans and neural pathway diagrams. "You weren't just a test subject, Elena. You were our greatest success. The room seemed to tilt around her. My name isn't Elena. No, your real name was Subject 47. Before that, Dr. Chen paused, studying her with something that might have been sympathy. Before that, you were Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, decorated war hero, until you discovered what your own government was planning to do with Cathedral technology. Images flashed across the screens, a woman in military dress uniform, receiving commendations, leading troops. The face was hers, but the confidence and authority in those photos belonged to someone else entirely, someone she couldn't remember being. You tried to expose the program, so they made you part of it instead. Dr. Chen closed the files and turned to face her. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. The soldier who wanted to protect people's minds became our test case for destroying them. Elena's legs gave out, and she sank onto one of the metal tables. Everything she'd believed about herself, her past, her identity, her reasons for being in the camp, had been carefully implanted lies. The resistance network that helped her escape, the underground railway that led her here, even her desperate need to reach this cathedral, all of it had been programmed into her. "Why are you telling me this?" she managed to ask. "Because the program is about to go live. They've perfected the process using your data, and tomorrow night they begin Phase 2. 100 soldiers, each given new identities and missions that will reshape the political landscape of 3 nations. Dr. Chen moved to a wall safe hidden behind one of the pillars. And because I helped create you, which means I'm the only one who might be able to undo what we did." She withdrew a metal briefcase and set it on the table beside Elena. "Inside are the neural inhibitors and memory restoration protocols I've been developing. They're untested, and using them might kill you. But if they work, you'll remember who you really were. You'll remember why you tried to stop Cathedral in the first place." Elena stared at the briefcase, her hands trembling. Everything she was existed because of a lie, but that lie had become her reality. To remember her true self meant losing Elena entirely, and Elena, manufactured or not, was all she had left. "Choose quickly," Dr. Chen said. "They'll discover you're here soon enough." The sound of Elena's footsteps echoed through the vast cathedral as she descended the spiral staircase carved into the stone walls. Each step took her deeper into the earth, farther from the altar where she'd discovered the truth about her father's work. The phosphorescent markings on the walls grew brighter as she descended, pulsing with an otherworldly rhythm that matched her racing heartbeat. At the bottom, a corridor stretched before her, lined with doors that bore symbols she now recognized from the documents above, the same symbols that had been tattooed on the prisoners in the camp, the same symbols that decorated her father's research notes. She pressed her palm against the first door, and it swung open with surprising ease. The room beyond defied comprehension. Rows of glass cylinders, filled with luminous fluid, stretched into the darkness, each containing what appeared to be organic tissue suspended in the glowing medium. Cables snaked between the containers, connecting them to monitoring equipment that hummed with electronic life. The air tasted metallic, sharp with the scent of preservatives and something else, something that reminded her of lightning. Elena moved between the cylinders, her reflection multiplied endlessly in their curved surfaces. In some, she could make out what looked like organs, hearts that still beat with mechanical precision, lungs that expanded and contracted in artificial rhythm. Others contained structures she couldn't identify, formations that seemed to shift and change as she watched. A soft chime drew her attention to a console at the room's center. As she approached, screens flickered to life, displaying streams of data in multiple languages, English, Russian, German, and others she didn't recognize. The numbers scrolled past too quickly to follow, but certain words caught her eye: Subject 47 Alpha, neural integration stable, memory reconstruction in progress. Her blood turned cold. Subject 47 Alpha. She remembered that designation from the camp record she'd glimpsed before her escape. It had been her number. Elena's trembling fingers found a keyboard, and she began typing commands her conscious mind didn't remember learning. The interface responded, screens reorganizing to display her file. Her photograph stared back at her, but not as she was now. This Elena looked younger, unmarked by the brutalities of the camp. Her hair was shorter, her eyes held a different light. Beneath the image, text scrolled past in clinical detail. Subject demonstrates exceptional compatibility with neural interface technology. Previous identity, Dr. Elena Vasquez, biochemist specializing in synthetic tissue development. Memory suppression, successful following extraction. Subject prepared for integration into Project Cathedral. The words swam before her eyes. Dr. Elena Vasquez. She whispered the name aloud, testing its weight on her tongue. Fragments of memory began to surface, a laboratory much like this one, her hands working with practiced precision among test tubes and microscopes. The satisfaction of a successful experiment, the horror of realizing what her research was being used for. She had tried to escape before, not from a prison camp, but from this place, this cathedral that existed in the spaces between official maps. They had found her, brought her back, and systematically dismantled everything that made her who she was. The brutal camp had been a cover story implanted in her reconstructed memories, designed to explain away the gaps where her real life used to be. Elena accessed more files, her stolen memories guiding her through security protocols she shouldn't have known. The scope of Project Cathedral sprawled across her screens, a network of facilities hidden across 3 continents, all working toward the same goal. They were building something vast and terrible, a fusion of human consciousness and artificial systems that would render traditional concepts of identity meaningless. The prisoners in the camp had been real, but they hadn't been political dissidents or war criminals. They had been scientists, researchers, doctors, anyone whose knowledge was deemed valuable enough to extract and preserve. Their bodies were discarded after the harvest, their minds archived in vast digital libraries. The neural tissue growing in these cylinders would host those stolen consciousnesses, creating a workforce of experts stripped of inconvenient concepts like ethics or free will. A new sound reached her ears, footsteps echoing from the stairwell above. They had discovered her absence from the altar. Elena's fingers flew across the keyboard, downloading everything she could onto a portable drive she found in the console drawer. The approaching footsteps quickened, accompanied now by voices calling her name. Not Elena, not the name they had given their stolen subject. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the woman who had helped create this technology before understanding its true purpose. The woman who had tried to destroy it and paid with her very identity. She pocketed the drive and turned toward the room's far wall, where her recovered knowledge told her an emergency exit waited. Behind a false panel, she found a narrow tunnel that led toward the surface. As she crawled through the cramped space, dust raining down with each movement, she could hear alarms beginning to wail in the cathedral above. Elena emerged from the tunnel into pre-dawn darkness. The cathedral's spires silhouetted against stars she was finally seeing with her own eyes rather than through implanted memories. She had escaped twice now from the same prison, though only now did she understand what she was truly running from. And this time, she knew exactly where to run to. The revelation struck Elena like a physical blow. She staggered backward, her legs threatening to give way as the impossible truth crashed over her in waves. The woman standing before her, older, weathered by years of suffering but unmistakably alive, was her sister Maria. "You're supposed to be dead," Elena whispered, her voice barely audible in the cathedral's vast silence. "They told me you died in the bombing of San Miguel. I saw the reports. I mourned you." Maria's eyes, once bright with laughter, now held depths of pain that seemed bottomless. "They told me the same about you. Said you'd been executed as a traitor." She stepped closer, her movements careful, as if approaching a wild animal that might bolt. "Elena, what they told us about each other, about the war, about everything, it's all been orchestrated." The cathedral around them suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a stage. Its soaring arches and stained glass windows nothing more than elaborate set pieces, in some cosmic theater of cruelty. Elena's mind raced, trying to process the implications of her sister's survival, her presence here in this hidden place. "The camps," Elena said, pieces of a horrific puzzle beginning to align in her consciousness. The experiments they conducted on us, the way they separated prisoners into different classifications. She looked at Maria with growing horror. "You were in a different camp, weren't you? Not a labor camp at all." Maria nodded slowly, her expression growing darker. "A research facility, hidden beneath what appeared to be a textile factory. They were studying us, Elena. Not just our physical responses to trauma, but our psychological breaking points. They wanted to understand how to manufacture compliance, how to reshape human nature itself." The cathedral's bells began to chime somewhere high above them, their deep, bronze voices echoing through the sacred space with haunting resonance. Elena counted 12 tolls, marking an hour that felt suspended between past and present, between the sister she had lost and the stranger who wore Maria's face. "But why?" Elena's voice cracked with the weight of the question. "Why us? Why any of this?" "Because we weren't random victims," Maria replied, her words carrying the bitter weight of terrible knowledge. "We were selected, chosen specifically because of who we are, what our family represented before the war. Father wasn't just a university professor, Elena. He was working on psychological research for the resistance, developing methods to help captured fighters resist interrogation and maintain their sanity under torture." The irony hit Elena like a slap. Their father's work to protect minds from breaking had led to his daughters becoming test subjects in the very process he had tried to prevent. The camps hadn't been punishment or even routine persecution, they had been laboratories, and she and Maria had been specimens in an experiment that spanned years. "The cathedral," Elena said, looking around at the impossible architecture surrounding them. "This place, hidden beneath the city. How long have they been planning this? How long have we been part of their design?" "Longer than we can imagine," Maria answered. "This structure was built during the war, but not for worship. It's a repository, Elena, a library of human suffering and resistance. Every person who passed through the camps, every experiment, every psychological profile, it's all documented here. We were never meant to escape or to die. We were meant to survive just long enough to lead them to others." The weight of this revelation settled over Elena like a shroud. Her escape from the camp, her flight through the wilderness, her discovery of this hidden cathedral, none of it had been chance or destiny. It had all been carefully orchestrated, a final phase in an experiment that had consumed years of their lives. "How many others?" Elena asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Hundreds, maybe thousands. The records I've seen suggest this project extends far beyond our region, beyond our war even. They've been perfecting these techniques across multiple conflicts, multiple populations." Maria's voice grew hollow. "We're not the first sisters they've reunited under false pretenses." Elena felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, as if her heart had cracked along invisible fault lines. The hope that had sustained her through months of imprisonment and escape, the dream of finding family and returning to some semblance of normal life, crumbled into dust. Even this moment, this reunion that should have been joyous, was tainted by manipulation and design. "Then we're still prisoners," Elena said quietly. "Even here, even now, we're still in their cage." Maria reached out tentatively and touched Elena's hand. The contact was electric, real in a way that cut through all the deception surrounding them. "Yes," she said simply, "but now we know it, and knowing changes everything." Above them, the cathedral's stained glass windows caught the last light of day, casting fractured rainbows across the stone floor. In that moment, surrounded by beauty built on suffering, the sisters stood together and began to plan their first truly free act of rebellion. The cathedral's stone floor trembled beneath Elena's feet as the massive doors sealed shut behind her. Father Matthias stood silhouetted against the stained glass, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, waiting. The weight of 17 chapters of deception, survival, and revelation pressed down on her shoulders like the cathedral's ancient stones. "You know why I'm here," Elena said, her voice echoing in the vast space. "I've always known." He turned slowly, and she saw her own eyes reflected in his face, the same steel grey, the same determined set of the jaw. "From the moment you were born, Elena, from the moment I gave you away." The word hung between them like incense, thick and suffocating. Father. Not the father she'd imagined during those brutal months in the camp, not the hero she'd constructed in her mind, but this man who'd orchestrated everything from within these hallowed walls. The resistance was never real, was it? She stepped closer, noting how the light through the windows cast him in alternating shadows and gold. The prison camp, the experiments, my escape, all of it was theatre. Not theatre, training. His voice carried the authority of decades spent delivering sermons, but now she heard the tremor underneath. "The war is real, Elena, more real than you know. But not the war they told you about in the camps." She reached into her jacket and withdrew the documents she'd found in the cathedral's hidden archives, pages covered in her father's handwriting, detailing something called Project Genesis. Her own name appeared dozens of times, alongside terms like enhanced cognition, stress adaptation, and psychological conditioning. "You made me into a weapon. I made you into hope." He moved toward the altar, gesturing for her to follow. "Come, let me show you what 18 years of preparation has built toward." Against every instinct screaming at her to run, Elena followed. The altar wasn't what it appeared to be. As Father Matthias pressed a hidden mechanism, the marble surface slid away to reveal a complex array of screens and controls. The cathedral had been hollow all along, a shell containing something far more sophisticated than any church. "The neural archive," he said, his fingers dancing across the controls. "Every memory, every skill, every piece of intelligence gathered from 1,000 operations like yours, all waiting for the right mind to contain it." The screens flickered to life, showing faces Elena recognized, other escapees from other camps, all bearing some resemblance to her, all with those same grey eyes. One by one, their files flashed red: deceased, failed, terminated. "They couldn't handle the integration," Father Matthias explained. "The human mind breaks when asked to contain that much information, that many contradictory experiences. But you," he touched her cheek with surprising gentleness, "you survived everything we put you through. The isolation, the experiments, the betrayals. You adapted." Elena jerked away from his touch. "You had my friends killed. Marcus, Sarah, David. They died believing they were fighting for freedom. They died so that freedom might be possible." His eyes hardened. "The enemy isn't who you think it is, Elena. The government, the camps, the resistance, all of it is controlled by something else. Something that's been manipulating human conflict for generations, feeding on war itself." The cathedral's bells began to chime, and Elena realized with growing horror that the sound wasn't coming from above. It emanated from the screens, from the archive itself. Each toll seemed to resonate inside her skull, awakening something that had been planted there long ago. "The conditioning is beginning," Father Matthias said. "You can feel it, can't you? The memories that aren't yours, the knowledge you never learned, the abilities you never developed. They're all here, waiting to be unlocked." Elena's vision blurred as foreign images flooded her mind. Tactical information, faces of targets she'd never seen, languages she'd never studied but suddenly understood. Her knees buckled, and she caught herself against the altar's edge. "Bite it," she whispered to herself. But even as she spoke, part of her was calculating escape routes, analyzing Father Matthias's weaknesses, planning his elimination with cold precision. "Don't fight it," he said. "Embrace what you were born to be. The war is coming, Elena, the real war. And humanity needs someone who can think like them, fight like them, but still choose to save us." The cathedral doors exploded inward. Armed figures in black tactical gear poured through the entrance, their weapons trained on Father Matthias. Elena's enhanced perception immediately catalogued their positions, their weapons, their likely next moves. The conditioning was complete. "Time's up, old man," the lead operative called out. "We're taking the girl." Elena looked at Father Matthias one last time, seeing him clearly for what he was. Not a monster or a savior, but a desperate man who'd gambled everything on his daughter's strength. She touched the activation panel on the archive, and 18 years of careful planning crystallized into a single moment of choice. The real war was beginning, and Elena finally knew which side she was on.